Hello, and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Tuesday, the 20th of June. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about yesterday. And yesterday in the States was Juneteenth, the celebration or the observation that on the 19th of June, the recognition that that slavery had ended. And I didn't know this. I knew about Juneteenth, but I didn't know that it didn't come about until Galveston, 2.5 years after Abraham Lincoln had emancipated the slaves. I didn't know that Texas didn't pass on that wee bit of information to their slaves, and that it was in Galveston 2.5 years later that the slaves understood that they truly were free and had been for some time. In Canada, I read yesterday someplace, I think, that we celebrate or we acknowledge Emancipation Day on the 1st of August, because we did indeed participate parts of our country in slavery. And if I'm not mistaken, we also, separate from residential schools and all that, some of our slaves were Aboriginal or Indigenous. I may be wrong, but I think I've read that before. Canada has a very different role in this slavery. In mostly what we learned about in school was the Underground Railroad and the places in Canada where people could safely flee when they were running from their slaveholders, their slave owners. So knowing, I know very little about the slave trade in Canada. I need to learn more about that. But there's something really powerful, I think, about acknowledging Juneteenth and taking a look back at what this means, especially with the current temperature. Um, we don't have, I have never in Canada, and I've lived in Ontario, Alberta, and Nova Scotia. I have never personally witnessed a great amount of prejudice, of racial bias toward Black people. In Nova Scotia, there was a bigger population of that with Africville and parts across the harbor from Halifax and Dartmouth. There are areas that are known that the police have been working for a few years to diligently try to stop the racial profiling and things like that. I don't know. I haven't lived there for 3 years, so I don't know how well they're doing. But I know that there was a real push to recognize that things were not as they should be in places. And as a matter of fact, there's even a television program called Digstown about that area. Um, so Canada is not, um, you know, lily white in all of this. But the recognition, the importance and recognition that there is some, I apologize, really loud outside my, it's like 9:41 at night and on Monday night when I'm recording this, and there's people out there because it's still light out here. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, in Alberta, at this time of the year, it's still light till almost 11 o'clock at night. We're that far north. But then by, this time in December, it'll be dark at 4. So we get, we get it on both ends. Um, but this idea lately that we need to start paying more closer attention to racial injustices and just in general to racism and how people are feeling. Check the temperature once in a while because it's insidious. We have a small town, probably more hamlet size up here on the highway when I drive to head to Edmonton. And the full 3 years I've been here, we drive by and there was an old abandoned restaurant that had a sign up. And we had a fair wind the other night, or a couple weeks ago. And I noticed that either someone has torn it off or the wind tore it off. I'm hoping it's just the wind. But it has a sign on it. The original name of the restaurant is a sign that had three innocent words, all spelled wrong, so that they were all spelled with the letter K. And, I'm kind of naive and innocent, and it didn't occur to me anything about that. But a friend of mine who is gay and who has friends who grew up here in the area and is recognizes there are places in this area where he doesn't feel comfortable being himself or being with his partner, um, simply because the homophobia is a thing here. And he told me about the fact that years ago that restaurant was called that intentionally because it was like a dog whistle. KKK. Everybody knew what it meant. Now, I don't know if that's really what it meant. I pray to God it isn't. And I pray to God that it's just, because of the wind that the sign has come down. Um, but I'm really hoping that the next time I drive past that restaurant, it's abandoned, has been in use in years, but the next time I drive by that lot, that building, that someone will have painted over that sign or taken it off completely, because I do find it, the fact that it even makes me think about that KKK makes me not just uncomfortable, but angry. You see, it's a slippery slope, this whole racism thing. It's not as black and white, pardon the phrase, but it's not as black and white as, either people, we have a community that is homophobic or racist or anti-Semitic, or we don't. All it takes is a few people to say a few things. Just sit at the bar on a Friday night or sit in a coffee shop and say a few things and nobody responds. Until enough people don't respond, and they say it often enough that it just gets to be part of the language. It gets to be part of what we think, and we don't really think, well, they don't mean, we know so and so, we know Bob, he doesn't mean that, he's not homophobic, or he's not anti-Semitic, or he's not a racist. He's just still Bob, right? The fact is that old Bob may indeed be just an old codger who doesn't know any better yet and should by this time but doesn't. Or, well, Bob's just letting his feelings be known because it's getting safer. And I was at a meeting the other night and somebody was making a joke about wokeness, and I really do think that their intention with the joke was to show that they just thought it was funny, that the group we were with is an open place for anyone to come in and hang out and have a beer and just be. But the fact is, it made me uncomfortable the way he said it, because I wasn't sure what he meant. And I was, as a priest and as a person, really feeling like I should stand up and say something. And the conversation quickly moved on, and he disappeared afterwards, and I didn't have a chance to speak to him. I'm still considering maybe having that conversation privately, just to say, hey, what did you mean when you said? Because you see, it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much at all for us to influence the people around us. You can be an older person who is looked up to by the younger people, and you say something and they're like, oh, wow, Mr. Smith thinks that, and he's pretty cool. Everybody likes him. Maybe Mr. Smith is right. Well, if Mr. Smith isn't right, what has he done? He's just given permission to young people to think a way that isn't right. Maybe he wasn't just being, innocent and naive. We need to stand up. We need to stand up. Somebody should have stood up in Texas 153 or 100, however many years ago it was, and said, wait a minute, the president, regardless of whether we recognize the president, like emancipation for slaves are free, but nobody did. It took somebody putting up documents, like I was listening to news and they said something about something coming in and putting up the decree on the wall of the post office or wherever. And it's like, and all of a sudden people realized they were free. The truth is that they have been free for 2.5 years. But people have been holding them hostage. They've been holding them as slaves because they could. It's not okay. It will be way too easy for us all, especially up here in Canada, where we just don't want to fight. We want to be nice. And, no, we don't really believe that any government or any body of people or any group of good old boys hanging out, on a Friday night doing their thing. We don't want to believe that any of them would go that far. We don't want to believe that anybody would pick up a gun and hurt somebody. Not up here, not in Canada. And yet sometimes it happens. Not that often. But once is too many times. If we don't pay attention to the language that we use, or the way we look at people, or the signs that have the KKK up there and don't bother to get taken down, it will create an atmosphere of, yeah, it's okay. And yeah, it's okay becomes, hey, wait a minute, we need to do something about this, in the wrong way. And that attitude of, hey, we need to do something about this becomes, we need to make a plan. We need to take care of those people. They aren't welcome here. They're different than we are, whatever they may be. We have to be cognizant and intentional and vigilant about making the right decisions. And the right decision will always be to love our neighbor and to love our enemy. The right decision will always be to take care of people, to make sure they are not enslaved, whether it is slavery itself, or enslaved by poverty, or enslaved by their gender and or their orientation because the rest of us just aren't comfortable. That's not okay. We aren't being locked down by the way nobody's asking me as a white heterosexual female to not do something. Well, some people tell me not to be a priest, but then hey, they can say that, but I'm still going to be a priest. But nobody's saying to me, you can't do this because who am I to say somebody else hasn't got the right to be the person they were born as because they're different than me? That's not what we're called to. As a Christian, I'm called to love. I am called to reach out to others, and I'm called to treat them as Jesus would treat them. And he didn't get the only time we know that he got really ticked off was in the temples and the overturned tables. And that wasn't about individual people. That was the way people were acting, that they were taking advantage of other people, that they were hurting other people intentionally. Jesus didn't look at somebody and say, oh, you're not like me, so you're not good. I'm not here to save you. Over the time that we know of the Jesus in the Gospels, he opened it up and he said, I have other sheep that you do not know. He commissioned his disciples to say, go into all the world, not just where the Jews are, where the Gentiles are, and other people, and tell them about me, tell them about love, tell them about peace and hope, and how we can take good care of each other. We can love one another. As we continue through this week, yesterday being Juneteenth, tomorrow being Canada's National Indigenous Day National Day for Indigenous Peoples, today we're sandwiched between two really important movements that must remind us that we are not called to judge and put down or persecute others, but we are called to love them and to lift them up and encourage them and help them have life. So as we think about Juneteenth and we think about tomorrow's National Indigenous Peoples Day, let us think about the call we have to love our neighbors, even those neighbors who are not like us. Because you know what? My experience may become your experience. That when we get out there and find out who our neighbors are, especially the ones who aren't like us, our lives just get bigger. Life just looks even better when you get to know people who are different than you are. Living in an echo chamber where other people just parrot back what you say is boring as all get out. But when you have conversations and learn about other people's backgrounds and hear about what they have to offer, what they have to teach, what you have to teach them, your world will only get bigger. Let's make this world so big that there's no worries that there's an old abandoned restaurant whose name starts with a KKK. Let's not need to think that 200, 300, 500 years from now, we will need another Juneteenth because of the slavery that happens to people. Or that we won't even need a national day for Indigenous peoples because they will simply be citizens in this country who are honored and respected and feel as much a part of it as every other Canadian. Let's work toward the day when everything is inclusive and we are loving one another as Jesus has loved us, as God has loved us. Let's work toward that. And wherever we see injustice, let's not make people wait 2.5 years to know that justice is theirs. Let's make sure that justice happens right now. Have a good day. God bless you. And I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.